a woman who learned to disappear, a duke who refused to look away, and a morning hunt that didn't end the way anyone expected. Least of all the man on his knees. Sarah stands at the wash basin in the pale hour before dawn, watching the water turn pink as she presses the cloth against her lip without making a sound. She does not flinch. She stopped flinching a long time ago, not because the pain had lessened, but because flinching was a luxury she could no longer afford. Flinching meant sound. Sound meant Edmund heard her. And Edmund hearing her in the dark hours of the morning was a cost she had already paid too many times to count. So she pressed the cloth to her lip with steady hands and watched the color bleed into the basin and told herself what she always told herself in these moments. 3 stops, then the warmth of the kitchen, then the part of the day that belongs to you. Edmund is just beyond the door. She can hear his boots on the floorboards, heavy and deliberate, the tread of a man who has never once considered that morning might hold consequences for him. He moves through the house the way he moves through the world, as though every surface exists to bear his weight without complaint, as though walls and women are made of the same material. Patient, absorbing, silent by design. She has learned to move like silence itself. Eyes down, collar high, pain folded beneath layers of wool and obedience and the particular discipline of a woman who understands that the most dangerous thing she can do is let him see that something inside her is still intact. Still watching. Still, despite everything, counting. 3 years she has survived that way. 3 years of basin water and careful buttons and the precise calculation of how much warmth is too much warmth, how much stillness is suspicious, how much of herself she can afford to show before he finds it and decides it belongs to him too. 3 years of learning the weight of his footstep, the difference between the flat tread that means he has drunk himself to the edge of sleep and the deliberate heel strike that means he is looking for something to be angry about. She has become a student of him in the way that prey becomes a student of the thing that hunts it. Not from fascination. From necessity. From the very basic and exhausting arithmetic of survival. But that morning something is different. A carriage with no crest arrived before the birds did. No announcement, just wheels on wet gravel in the dark hour before first light, and the kind of stillness that settles over an entire house when real authority enters its proximity without needing to announce itself. The servants had felt it before they saw it. She had felt it from the upstairs window, watching the dark shape of the carriage on the lane below. Anonymous, unhurried, patient in the way that only things with no reason to rush are ever truly patient. She did not see his face clearly at first. Only the dark coat. The set of the shoulders. The way he stepped down from the carriage and looked at the house with the quiet, assessing attention of a man cataloging a situation he had already prepared for. And then he looked up, not at the house, not at the lane, not at the pale ribbon of pre-dawn sky above the tree-line, but directly at the upstairs window where she stood with the curtain barely parted and her breath held without quite knowing why. The cold, unhurried eyes of a man who had never once needed volume to fill a room. He looked at her collar. Then her hands. Then directly into her eyes, across the distance of the lane and the dark glass and the 3 years she had spent making herself impossible to see, and he did not look away. He did not soften his gaze into something more comfortable. He simply looked, with the steady, undeflected attention of someone who had decided that the truth of what he was seeing was worth the discomfort of seeing it clearly. And Edmund, who had never feared anything in his life, who had walked through every morning of their marriage with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once been made to account for himself, Edmund, just beyond the chamber door with his heavy deliberate boots and his cold inventory of her failings, went very quiet. Not the quiet of sleep. Not the quiet of drink. The quiet of a man who has just felt, for the first time, the specific chill of being watched by someone with the means to do something about what they see. Sarah stood at the window with the cloth pressed to her lip and the basin water going cold behind her, and she did not yet know his name. She did not yet know what his arrival would cost either of them. She did not yet know that in 3 weeks' time she would be standing in an open misty field at dawn, watching the man beyond that door go down onto his knees in the wet grass and beg. Not her, he would never beg her, but beg nonetheless, with his hands clasped and his voice stripped of every certainty he had ever wielded against her. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the morning had changed, and that for the first time in 3 years the change had not come from him. Before we get deep into the story, Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The ivory table expected her by 7, and Sarah had never once been late. She tied her apron with quick, practiced hands in the narrow corridor off the eastern entrance, the one that smelled of rendered fat and fresh rosemary and the faint sweetness of bread already baking in the lower kitchen. The warmth of the place wrapped around her the moment she stepped through the door. Not the warmth of comfort exactly, but something close enough that she had stopped distinguishing between them. This was the one place in her life that Edmund had not yet found a way to reach. The one place her silence read as competence rather than fear. She smoothed the front of her dress, squared her shoulders, and became, in the space of 3 deliberate breaths, the version of herself that this building required. Margot was waiting at the end of the corridor with her arms folded and her sharp eyes already doing the thing they always did when Sarah arrived after a difficult night. Moving across her face once, quickly, filing what they found, and then looking deliberately away. Margot never asked. In 3 years she had never once asked. But she always assigned Sarah the interior tables, well away from the tall windows and the unforgiving wash of afternoon light that fell across the main dining room between 2 and 4. That was its own kind of mercy, and Sarah had learned to receive it without comment. The Alderton party arrives at noon, Margot said, already turning back toward the hall. Lord Prescott has taken the private East Room for a separate luncheon at 1:30, and we have a new reservation for the evening sitting. Single party. No name given. Table 12. Sarah followed her, soft leather shoes quiet on the stone floor. No name. Margot paused at the door to the main hall and glanced back once. The reservation came through a solicitor's office. Whoever it is, they paid the private booking fee without negotiation. So we treat accordingly. Sarah nodded and pushed through into the dining room. The next 4 hours passed in a rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. Tables dressed with the precision Margot demanded. Crystal at the exact angle the candlelight required. Fresh flowers drawn from the cold room and arranged without excess or sentiment. The kitchen issued its morning briefing. The sommelier moved through the wine cellar with his ledger. The lunch service arrived and moved through its careful choreography of silver and low conversation and the particular self-satisfied murmur of men who believed the world arranged itself around their ease. Sarah moved through it all like water finding its level. Unhurried. Present without being visible. She refilled glasses before they emptied. She anticipated requests before they were spoken. She smiled with exactly the warmth the room required and not a fraction more. It was the one place she was good at something. The one place her silence was an asset rather than a surrender. She did not notice him immediately. The evening sitting had filled steadily through the late afternoon. The usual procession of titled men and their carefully dressed companions, the merchants who had recently acquired enough wealth to afford the pretense of old money, the occasional widow of means who dined alone with a composure that Sarah privately admired. She was carrying a tray back toward the service corridor when Margot appeared at her elbow with the particular quietness she reserved for moments that required discretion. Table 12, Margot said. He arrived a few minutes ago. Go now. Sarah set her tray on the side table and turned. Table 12 sat in the far interior of the room, positioned in the corner that caught neither the window light nor the direct fall of the chandelier above. It was the most private table in the main hall. The reservation had clearly known to ask for it. The man seated there was alone. He was not the kind of man you looked at once and looked away from. He was the kind of man you looked at and then had to consciously remind yourself to breathe. He sat with his back to the wall, which told her something immediately. A man who positioned himself to see every entrance in a room was a man who had learned that danger rarely announced itself. His coat was dark, almost black in the low candlelight, cut with the clean, unadorned precision that spoke of real wealth rather than the performance of it. His dark hair was neat without being studied. His jaw was set in the particular stillness of someone who is never unaware of anything happening around them. He was not looking at the menu. He was looking at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at the serving women of the ivory table, with the casual proprietary assessment that made Sarah's skin pull tight across her shoulders. This was different. This was the way a man looked at something that had already troubled him before he understood why. She crossed the room and stopped at the appropriate distance. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the precise temperature of practiced warmth. "May I bring you something to begin?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across her face with a slowness that was almost clinical, and then settled on a point just below her left cheekbone. The bruise. She had turned into the candlelight without thinking. A rookie mistake. 3 years and she still made rookie mistakes. She adjusted her angle slightly, the correction so habitual it required no thought. "Water," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed volume to command a room. "And whatever your sommelier considers his finest red this evening." "Of course." She turned to go. "What is your name?" She paused. Guests did not typically ask. "Sarah, sir." He said nothing further. She walked back toward the service corridor and told herself the prickling along the back of her neck was nothing, only the ordinary awareness of being watched. She was used to being watched. It had never felt like this before. Every time she moved through the room that evening, across the full length of the dining hall, around corners, behind pillars, table 12 was never quite out of her peripheral vision. And every time she glanced toward it, Gabriel Weston was not looking at the food. He was not looking at the wine. He was not engaged in the particular theater of self-importance that occupied every other guest in the room. He was watching Sarah Ashton with the patient, absolute attention of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. She did not know what the decision was. She found out before the evening ended. Margot found her in the linen corridor near the close of service, folding napkins with the automatic precision of someone whose hands knew the work well enough to do it without instruction. "The gentleman at table 12 has requested a word." Margot's voice was carefully neutral. "He has asked that you be sent to the east antechamber." Sarah's hands stilled on the linen. "Me specifically." "You specifically." Margot paused, then held up a folded card. "He left this for Mr. Romano. Romano read it and told me to tell you to go." That was unusual enough to be alarming. Yeppy Romano was not a man who sent his staff into private rooms at the request of guests, regardless of what those guests had spent across the course of an evening. Whatever was written on that card had changed the calculation entirely. Sarah set down the napkin, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked. The east antechamber was a small wood-paneled room off the main corridor, used occasionally for private conversations between parties who required discretion. It smelled of old leather and candle smoke and the pleasant, faded ghost of 1,000 expensive meals. Gabriel Weston was standing when she entered, not seated as she had expected, but standing with his hands clasped behind his back, facing the small fireplace, the orange light moving across the sharp planes of his profile. He turned when she stepped through the door. "Close the door, please." She did. For a moment he simply looked at her with that same unhurried assessment that had unsettled her all evening. Then he crossed the room, not toward her, but to the side, so that the light from the wall sconce fell directly across her face. She knew immediately what he was doing. She turned her head. "Don't." The word was quiet. It stopped her completely. Not because it was a command, though it was, but because there was something in it that was not cruelty, not entitlement. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He looked at the bruise for a long moment. "How long?" he said. "I am not sure what you mean, sir." "You understand precisely what I mean." "How long?" The silence stretched. Somewhere in the main hall a chair scraped against the floor and a man laughed at something that was probably not as clever as he believed. "That is not a matter I am in a position to discuss with guests," Sarah said carefully. Gabriel studied her for another long moment. Then he moved to the writing desk in the corner, opened it, removed a card, and wrote something in a single clean line. He crossed back and held it out. She took it. On it was written an address. Below the address, one line. "Send word when you are ready. Do not wait until you have no other choice." "I don't understand," she said. "You do," he said simply. "You are only not yet ready to admit it." He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame, his back still to her. "The man who did that to your face." Is he the kind of man who stops? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah did not answer. She did not need to. Gabriel Weston nodded once, as though she had spoken an entire volume, and left without another word. She stood alone in the antechamber with the card in her hand, and the fire burning low and the sounds of the closing service moving quietly beyond the door. She looked at the address. She looked at the single line beneath it. Then she folded the card with careful fingers and tucked it inside the lining of her coat, in the small inner pocket where she kept the things she could not afford to lose. She told herself it would come to nothing. She told herself that on the walk home too. She almost believed it by the time she reached their street. Almost. The light was on in the front window. Sarah stopped on the pavement outside and read it the way she always read it before turning the key, the way she had learned to read every signal this house produced, the way a sailor reads weather, not from curiosity but from the very practical need to know what was coming before it arrived. Light on meant he was awake. Front room, not the bedchamber, meant he had not yet drunk himself into insensibility. The stillness of the curtains meant he had not heard her on the street yet. She had perhaps 30 seconds of advantage. She went in quietly, easing the front door on its hinges with the careful expertise she had developed without ever intending to, and kept her footsteps light on the bare floorboards of the entrance hall. "You're late." Edmund was in the armchair by the window, a half-empty bottle resting against his knee. He was still dressed, which was never a good sign at this hour. He had the look he sometimes got, not the red-faced rage she had learned to weather, but the cold watching stillness that was somehow worse. The expression of a man taking a careful inventory of grievances. The evening service ran long, Sarah said, and kept moving toward the corridor. "You're walking different." She stopped. "I beg your pardon." Edmund set the bottle on the floor beside the chair with a deliberate care that made her stomach tighten. He tilted his head, studying her with the blurry, dangerous attention of a man who had spent years cataloging her smallest behaviors. "Your head is up. That's not your Romano's look. That's something else. Who did you speak to tonight?" "Guests," she said. "That is the nature of service. Don't be clever with me." He was on his feet before she registered the movement, the chair scraping back against the floorboards. "I know that look. I know every look you have, and that one doesn't belong to me." "Edmund." Her voice stayed level through a discipline that cost her more than she would ever let him see. "I am tired. I would like to go to bed." "You'd like to go to bed." He moved closer and she held her ground because moving backward had never once helped, and she had learned that much at least. "One of those titled men come in tonight and give you ideas above your station? Fill your head with something pretty. No one gave me anything." The blow came from the left, which was not where she had expected it. She caught the doorframe with her shoulder as she stumbled, and the sharp edge of it sent a pain radiating down her arm that she filed away to deal with later. His hand caught her collar and pulled her upright, and she kept her face still, deliberately, carefully still, because letting him see her react was the thing that fed him. "You think someone is going to save you?" His voice was low and close and smelled of cheap spirits. "You think someone is going to look at you and see anything worth the trouble? You are nothing, Sarah. You were nothing before me, and you would be nothing without me." She said nothing. She thought of the card in the inner pocket of her coat. She thought of an address written in a single clean line. She thought of a man who had looked at her bruise without flinching and asked a question she had not answered. Edmund released her collar with a shove and turned back toward his chair, retrieving his bottle with the supreme confidence of a man who believed the conversation was finished because he had decided it was finished. Sarah straightened her collar, walked quietly to the bedchamber, closed the door. She did not undress. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to the sounds of the house settling around Edmund's eventual heavy breathing from the front room. She turned the facts over the way she always turned them, like stones, examining what lived beneath each one. He was not going to stop. She had known that for a long time. She had simply been refusing to know it in the particular way that makes knowing require action. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and found the card by feel. She did not need light to read it. She already knew what it said. She sat with it in the dark for a long time. Then she rose, moved to the narrow wardrobe, and began, quietly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that speed invited noise, to pack a bag. Not everything. Only what she could carry without it looking like leaving, in case he woke before she reached the door. 3 changes of clothes. The small envelope of coins she had been setting aside in the lining of her winter coat for 7 months without ever quite allowing herself to name what she was saving them for. The card. She was at the door before first light. Edmund's breathing had not changed. The floorboards did not betray her. The street outside was cold and still and smelled of rain. She did not look back at the lit window. She walked. She did not send word. She had told herself on the walk through the dark streets that she would find a messenger boy, that she would do it properly, that she would not simply arrive at a stranger's address in the hour before dawn with a bag in her hand and nowhere else to go. She had told herself that all the way to the end of the lane. And then she had kept walking, because the alternative was turning back, and turning back meant the front door and the front window and the particular quality of silence that preceded Edmund waking, and her body had apparently made its own decision before her mind had finished its deliberations. The carriage found her 2 streets before she found the address. A broad, still man stepped down from the box with his hat in his hands and said her name quietly, the way you said the name of someone you had been expecting. Corbin, he said simply, when she stared at him. I work for the Duke of Ravenmore. He asked me to come out this morning, in case you had decided not to send word yourself. She got in without speaking. There did not seem to be anything adequate to say. The city gave way to wider roads, and the wider roads gave way to the part of the city she had only ever moved through at its edges. As a servant, as a shadow, as a woman whose business in fine streets was always understood to be someone else's. The house that eventually appeared through the carriage window was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said what she had imagined. It was large without being ostentatious, built of pale stone that had aged to the color of old honey, surrounded by the kind of quiet that money did not buy but old land accumulated naturally over centuries. Iron gates. A gravel approach. Windows that caught the early light and held it as though they had been waiting for it. Corbin helped her down without ceremony and led her up the front steps. Inside, the entrance hall was marble and dark wood and the kind of silence that was not empty but full. The silence of a place where things happened slowly and with great deliberation. Not the silence of her marriage, which was always a held breath, always the pause before something broke. This was different. This silence had no threat inside it. She stood in it and did not quite know what to do. Gabriel was at the far end of the hall. He was not in his evening coat now, a white linen shirt, dark trousers, sleeves turned back at the cuffs. He looked less like the composed, unreadable presence she had observed across the dining room of the ivory table, and more like a man who had been awake for most of the night and had not bothered to pretend otherwise. He looked at her, at the bag in her hands, at the way she was standing with her chin up and her shoulders already braced for a blow that wasn't coming. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you must be hungry. It was such a quiet, ordinary thing to say that Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held. She nodded. I am, she admitted. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Then come, he said, and turned toward the corridor that led to the back of the house. Edmund Crane does not know this address. He does not know my name. He will not find you here. Sarah stood in the entrance hall of Ravenmore with her small bag and her high collar and her carefully arranged hair, and she breathed in the silence of a place where no one was sleeping off a night of cruelty in the next room, and she felt, not safe, not yet, she did not yet know what safe felt like from the inside, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested safe might be a direction she was now, for the first time, actually facing. She followed him. For the first time in 3 years she walked through a doorway without calculating what it would cost her. The first few days at Ravenmore passed the way convalescence always does. Slowly, and with the particular discomfort of a body that has forgotten what rest feels like. Sarah was given a room on the 2nd floor, east-facing, with windows that caught the morning light and a bed wider than any she had slept in before. The sheets were clean and heavy and smelled of nothing except linen and lavender. On the first night she lay in the center of them and stared at the ceiling and waited for the sound she had trained herself to sleep through. The scrape of a boot. The clink of a bottle. the specific quality of silence that preceded violence. None of them came. What came instead was birdsong, eventually, and then the pale gray of a country dawn pressing through the curtains, and then the sound of the household beginning its morning in the unhurried, orderly way of a well-run estate. She did not know what to do with peace. It sat on her like an ill-fitting garment, something borrowed from another woman's life. Gabriel she saw only at meals, and even then not always. He was a man of considerable movement, receiving visitors in his study, riding out early, returning late, managing what appeared to be an extensive network of interests conducted through a steady procession of quiet, purposeful men who arrived, were shown in, and departed with the contained energy of people who had received clear instructions. He did not explain himself. He did not offer the kind of solicitous attention she had half expected and half dreaded. He treated her presence in his house with the same matter-of-fact steadiness with which he seemed to treat everything else, as though her being there was simply a fact of the situation that required no particular comment. She was not sure if that made her feel safer or more unsettled. On the fourth evening she found him in the library. She had not been looking for him. She had been looking for something to read, because the silence of her room had begun to press on her in a different way. The way silence does when the immediate terror has faded and what remains is the vast, shapeless question of what comes next. The library door was half open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside before she registered that the room was not empty. Gabriel was seated in one of the deep leather chairs near the fireplace. Not reading. Not writing. Simply sitting with a glass of something dark resting on the arm of the chair and his eyes on the middle distance. The fire had burned down to a low orange pulse. The room smelled of old books and wood smoke and the particular stillness of late evening. He looked up when she entered. "I apologize," Sarah said immediately, beginning to withdraw. "I did not realize you were here. Stay." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please." She stayed. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the careful posture of a woman who had learned that taking up too much space invited correction. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the grounds with a low persistent sound. "You are wondering," Gabriel said finally, "why I am doing this." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I know what you are doing," she said. "I am less certain of what it costs you. And why someone like you would choose to pay it." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "My mother was a seamstress," he said. The change in direction was abrupt enough that she blinked. "Did you know that?" "I did not. Most people do not." He settled back slightly, his eyes returning to the fire. "She came to the city when she was 21 with a skill and very little else. She found work in a house on Mercer Street, alterations and fine work, the kind of labor that is invisible until it is imperfect." A pause. "She married a man who seemed at first like stability." Sarah went very still. "He was not stable," Gabriel continued, his voice carrying the particular evenness of a man who has told a story so many times inside his own head that the telling of it has become a controlled thing. "He was charming and then he was not. And by the time she understood the difference, she had no money of her own, no connections he had not already poisoned, and nowhere that felt like it was truly hers to go." His jaw tightened briefly. "She stayed for 6 years. Because that is what women were told to do. Because the law offered her nothing. Because she had a son, and she believed, the way they teach you to believe, that even a bad situation survived together was better than an uncertain one faced alone." He stopped. Drank from the glass. She arrived at the kitchen door of a restaurant on Halford Street one winter morning with a broken arm she had told the surgeon she sustained in a fall. The fire crackled between them. "My father saw her," Gabriel said quietly. He was not a sentimental man by nature. He was, in most respects, the kind of man who kept the world at a precise and comfortable distance. He looked at her once across that kitchen and he could not look away. He spent the next 4 months dismantling every obstacle between her and a life of her own choosing. Not because the law required it. Because he decided it was necessary, and he had the means to make his decisions real. He looked at Sarah then, with that same directness that had never once softened itself into something more comfortable. She was 32 years old when she stopped flinching at sudden movements. I was 9. I remember the exact morning. She laughed at breakfast. A real laugh. And I had never heard it before in my life. Sarah looked at the fire. She did not trust herself to look at him. I am not my father, Gabriel said quietly. I do not claim to be. But I grew up understanding one thing with complete clarity, that there are situations the law will not correct, that society will not address, that no one will intervene in unless someone with the means to intervene decides that it is simply worth the cost. He set the glass down on the side table with a small final sound. Edmund Crane is not the first man of his kind I have encountered in this city. He will not be the last. But he is the one who sat across a dining room while his wife served other men their wine with a bruise on her face she had tried to hide. And he will find that this particular circumstance carries consequences he did not anticipate. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said more than they intended and were deciding, quietly, whether to regret it. Your mother, Sarah said at last. Is she well? Gabriel was quiet for a moment. She died 3 years ago, he said. In her own house. In her own bed. With her affairs entirely in order and a garden she had planted herself and a life that belonged to no one except her. A pause. She was happy. I know that with certainty because she told me so. And she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. Sarah nodded slowly. She thought about what it would mean to die in a life that belonged entirely to herself. She could not quite imagine the shape of it yet. But for the first time in a long while, it did not feel entirely beyond imagining. Mrs. Corwin arrived on a Tuesday morning in a carriage that announced nothing about itself from the outside and everything about its owner from the inside. Sarah caught a glimpse of the interior as the door opened. Dark silk, organized documents, the quiet, devastating efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years making the law do things it had not initially intended. Mrs. Corwin herself was small, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pinned with architectural precision and eyes that moved across a room the way a surveyor's gaze moved across unmapped territory. Quickly, comprehensively, missing nothing. She wore deep burgundy and carried a leather case that she set on Gabriel's study table with the confidence of someone who had never once in her professional life been made to feel she did not belong in a room. Sarah had been asked to attend the meeting. She sat across the table with her hands folded and the residual habit of making herself small still present in the angle of her shoulders, and she listened to the woman across from her speak in the precise, unhurried cadences of someone who had never once needed to raise her voice to be absolutely understood. The situation as it stands, Mrs. Corwin began, spreading documents across the table with practiced efficiency, is not without its complications. A wife seeking separation from a husband of 3 years without independent means or property would, under ordinary circumstances, find the process protracted and costly. She looked up. These are not ordinary circumstances. Sarah glanced at Gabriel, who stood to the left of the table with his arms folded and said nothing. We have, Mrs. Corwin continued, documented medical records from the surgeon on Caldwell Street spanning 22 months. 3 visits, each recorded as accidental injury. She paused meaningfully. The surgeon is prepared to clarify his notes under formal examination. Sarah stared at her. How did you obtain those? The surgeon came forward of his own accord, Mrs. Corwin said, in a tone that suggested the elaboration was not relevant to the current discussion. We additionally have 2 written statements from individuals who witnessed Edmund Crane's behavior on separate public occasions. And we have a letter written in your husband's own hand which contains language that any examining magistrate would find deeply instructive. Sarah felt the breath leave her slowly. I did not give you a letter. No, Mrs. Corwin agreed. You did not. She moved on without pause. The combination of this evidence renders the matter considerably less complicated than it might otherwise appear. Edmund Crane has, in the language of my profession, a very weak hand. He does not know this yet. By the time he understands it fully, the relevant documents will already be in process. Sarah sat with this for a moment, the precision of it, the months of invisible preparation it implied, undertaken before she had even walked through the door of Raven Moor, before she had accepted the card in the antechamber of the ivory table. She looked at Gabriel. He did not look away. How long have you been watching? She asked. Long enough, he said. To know that you were not going to ask for help yourself. It should have felt like a violation. She examined it carefully, turning it over in the quiet of the room, and found that what it actually felt like was something more complicated. The particular feeling of discovering that someone had been paying close attention during the years you spent believing yourself entirely invisible. Mrs. Corwin, who had the professional grace to appear wholly absorbed in her documents during this exchange, looked up at precisely the right moment. "I will need your signature on several items, Miss Ashton. At your convenience. There is no urgency today." "There may be urgency," Gabriel said quietly. "Sooner than we would prefer." His voice had shifted slightly, acquiring the particular quality she had come to associate with him in motion, the contained forward energy of a man processing news he had already begun to act on. Edmund was released from the magistrate's hold this morning. The charge did not hold without a complainant present. The room went quiet. Sarah felt the familiar cold move through her chest, the one that had been mercifully absent for nearly 2 weeks and had apparently simply been waiting, patient as everything Edmund had ever done to her, for the moment to return. "He will go to the ivory table," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by it. Gabriel nodded. "Which is why Corbin is already there." Mrs. Corwin closed her leather case with a small, decisive sound and looked between them both with the composed expression of a woman who had sat in many rooms where difficult things were being understood for the first time. She said nothing further. She did not need to. The documents were prepared. The evidence was assembled. The hand Edmund Crane held was weak and growing weaker by the hour. All that remained now was the reckoning. She did not go to the ivory table that day. Gabriel had asked her not to, quietly, without making it a command, and she stayed at Raven Moor and sat in the library with a book she did not read, and listened to the silence of the estate, and tried not to think about Margot and the kitchen staff and the familiar smell of rosemary and rendered fat, and whether Edmund in a desperate temper was a danger to people who had never done anything to him. Corbin returned at 4. He spoke to Gabriel in the study for a few minutes. Then Gabriel came to the library doorway and leaned against the frame with his hands in his pockets and the careful neutral expression of a man deciding how much to say. "Edmund arrived at the ivory table at midday," he said. "He demanded to know where you were. Margot told him you were no longer employed there, which is not true, but was the correct answer. He became agitated." A pause. "He broke a window on his way out." Sarah set the book down. "Was anyone hurt?" "No. Margot is unharmed. Yeppy Romano has already filed a complaint with the magistrate's office regarding the damage." Another pause. "Edmund was heard asking questions of people in the street outside. He used your name. He also used language that several bystanders found threatening." Sarah stood up from the chair, not from agitation but from something more like clarity. The particular crystalline quality of a moment when the thing you have been dreading finally steps fully into the light and you can see its actual dimensions without the distortion of fear. "He is not going to stop," she said. "No," Gabriel said. "He is not." She met his eyes across the room. "What happens now?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was sometimes quiet, not from uncertainty, but from the deliberate pacing of a man who chose his words with the same precision he applied to everything else. Then he said, "Now I handle it." Something in his voice had changed. Not volume. Not heat. It was a subtraction rather than an addition. The removal of whatever thin layer of social moderation he customarily maintained over whatever lay beneath it. What remained was something older and considerably less comfortable to look at directly. Sarah looked at it directly anyway. "I want him gone," she said. "Not hurt. Gone." "Those two things," Gabriel said, "are not mutually exclusive." She was not there to see it. She had not been asked to be, and she had not asked to go. What she knew of it came later, in pieces, from Corbin's quiet account, delivered the following evening in the matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting on weather. The morning of the hunt was cold and pale, the sky the color of unpolished pewter, the ground still soft from 2 days of autumn rain. It was not the kind of gathering that appeared in the social pages. No printed invitations. No assembled gentry in their finest. No hounds. This was a different kind of morning, the kind that certain men in certain cities understood without needing it explained. Edmund had received a note the previous evening. Brief. Precise. It told him where to come, at what hour, and implied with a particular economy of language that leaves no room for misunderstanding that the matter of Sarah Ashton would be resolved at that location and that his presence was not optional. He came because men like Edmund always came when they believed the confrontation would be on their terms. He arrived at the edge of the field to find it already occupied. Gabriel stood in the center of the open ground, coat dark against the pale morning, hands at his sides, the mist moving around him in slow curls. Behind him, at a distance, 3 horses stood with their riders. Corbin was one. The other 2 Sarah did not ask about. Edmund had arrived with bluster, which was the only vocabulary he possessed. He made demands. He invoked the law and his rights and the institution of marriage in the tones of a man who had always found those words sufficient. Gabriel listened without interruption. Then he walked forward slowly until he stood close enough that Edmund could not have looked away if he had wanted to, and he spoke very quietly for a considerable length of time. Corbin said he never once raised his voice. He did not need to. What he laid out, with the methodical clarity of a man who had prepared thoroughly and felt nothing that resembled doubt, was the complete and total picture of Edmund Crane's situation. The medical records. The surgeon's testimony. The letter in Edmund's own hand. The witness statements. The magistrate's complaint regarding the ivory table. The additional material gathered through channels Corbin declined to specify. The portrait of a man whose every action across 3 years had been quietly, comprehensively documented by people he had never known were watching. And then, when Edmund had finished cycling through rage and bluster and the particular desperation of a man watching the ground disappear beneath him, Gabriel presented the alternative. A sum sufficient to begin elsewhere. Passage arranged on a vessel departing within the week. A new city. A new country. A new set of circumstances entirely. The legal proceedings suspended. The documents sealed. His name kept from the public record. In exchange for one thing. His permanent and irrevocable absence. Edmund tried once to reintroduce the question of his rights. Gabriel looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Edmund did not try again. He knelt eventually, though Corbin was careful to note that no one had required him to. It was simply what happened when the full weight of a man's consequences finally settled on him after 3 years of believing himself weightless. His legs gave out. He went down onto the wet grass of the field with the morning mist curling around him and his hands clasped in the posture of a man who had run out of every other option. Gabriel waited until he was finished. Then he told him the departure time of the vessel. Then he walked back toward the horses without looking back. Edmund Crane left the country 9 days later. He did not say goodbye to anyone, because there was no one left who would have wanted him to. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a city. Buildings do not rise or fall. Streets do not move. The seasons shift, the light changes its angle and quality, and the particular smell of the air transitions from the cold damp of autumn to the tentative warmth of a spring that arrives in this part of the country with characteristic reluctance, as though it is not entirely certain it has been invited. 6 months is, however, a considerable time in the life of a woman who has decided to stop being invisible. Sarah still worked. She had insisted on that, and Gabriel had not argued, because he was a man who understood that dignity does not coexist with dependency, that what she needed was not rescue so much as the restoration of the ground beneath her own feet. She had returned to the ivory table in November. Yeppie had greeted her with the particular gruff brevity of a man who felt things strongly and had never developed the vocabulary for it. Margot had said nothing at all, simply handed her an apron and pointed at the tables that needed setting. It was, in its way, the warmest welcome she had ever received. She moved differently now. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden transformation of a story that requires its ending to announce itself. But differently in the small accumulating ways that other people noticed before she did. Her head stayed level. Her shoulders did not round toward her chest when someone raised a voice nearby. She stopped calculating the distance to the nearest door every time she entered a room. She still startled at sudden sound sometimes. She suspected she always would. That was not shame. That was simply what 3 years wrote into a body, and bodies took their own time about revision. On an afternoon in early April, she was sitting in the East Garden at Raven Moor with a letter from Mrs. Corwin confirming the final dissolution of all legal ties between herself and Edmund Crane. The paper was formal and dense with the particular language of the law, but its meaning was simple. She was, in every sense that could be documented, her own person. She was reading it for the third time when Gabriel came out of the house and crossed the garden toward her with his coat over his arm and the unhurried walk of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. He sat beside her on the bench without asking if the space was available. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, set it down between them, said nothing for a moment. "How does it feel?" he asked. Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The garden was quiet around them. The first of the spring flowers were making their careful provisional appearance along the stone border. A bird was conducting some complicated and urgent business in the elm at the garden's edge. "Like a door," she said finally. "That has been standing open for a while, and I have only just noticed that I am allowed to walk through it." Gabriel looked at her with the directness that had never quite become comfortable, and that she had stopped wanting to become comfortable, because it was the most honest thing anyone had ever offered her. "Are you going to?" he asked. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her dress. She looked out at the garden and the elm and the bird conducting its urgent invisible business, and at the pale spring light sitting on the tops of the stone walls. She thought about a basin of pink water and a pair of boots beyond a door and 3 years of counting days the way prisoners counted them. Not toward anything, simply to mark that time was still moving even when nothing else was. She thought about a card in an inner coat pocket. A single line. "Do not wait until you have no other choice." She thought about a woman she had not yet become, standing in a life that belonged entirely to herself, with a garden she had planted and a laugh her children would one day say they had always known. "Yes," she said. She did not look at him when she said it, and she did not need to, because some things do not require eye contact to be understood between two people who have spent 6 months learning each other's silences. The bird finished its business and departed. The light shifted by a fraction. A breeze moved through the garden with the unhurried ease of something that had nowhere else to be. Sarah Ashton sat on the bench at Raven Moor with a letter in her pocket and her shoulders level and her chin at the angle of a woman who had decided, with full knowledge of what it had cost to arrive here, that she was going to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she was choosing it. That was the difference. That was everything. And that is where we leave Sarah Ashton. Not running. Not hiding. Not pressing a cloth to her lip in the dark and telling herself that 3 stops was enough to survive for. But sitting in a garden in the pale April light with a letter in her pocket that says, in the careful language of the law, what she already knew in her bones, that she belongs to no one except herself, that the door has been standing open, and that she is finally, after everything, walking through it. If this story found you today, if something in Sarah's silence felt familiar, if you held your breath when she picked up that bag, if you felt something loosen in your own chest when she sat in that garden and said yes, then you already know why we tell these stories here. Because there are women living inside a version of this right now, who are timing their footsteps so the floorboards don't betray them, who are arranging their hair to cover what their collar cannot reach, who have folded a card and tucked it somewhere safe and told themselves it will probably come to nothing. This one is for them. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you even a little, the most powerful thing you can do right now is share it. Not for the numbers. For the woman in your life who might need to hear it. For the one who is still counting days and has not yet been told that counting toward something is allowed. And if you are not ready to go yet, if you want more stories like this one, stories where the quiet ones win and justice arrives without raising its voice, then hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing and it means everything to this channel. Ring that notification bell so you never miss what is coming next. Because we have more stories waiting. More women who learned to disappear and more mornings that changed everything and more fields where the wrong man finally, irrevocably, ran out of ground to stand on. Drop a comment below and tell me your name and where you are watching from tonight. Tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me which moment stayed with you. Your voice matters here. And if you leave your name, it might just be the one we call out at the beginning of the next story. Like this. Share it forward. And welcome truly to the family. We will see you in the next one.